All right, welcome to a new episode of Kali Claptrap Integral Conversations. Today's guest is Ann Gleig. Ann, thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for the invite.
Awesome. So Ann is an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Central Florida and an author of a book we will be discussing today, American Dharma. And yes, it's a beautiful cover too, by the way.
Yeah.
Before discussing the book, I was hoping to hear a little bit about your background and what led you to become a professor of religious studies.
Yeah, sure. So really, I wanted to study religion because a lot of the questions that I had, were existential. So I, was really interested, in kind of existential questions. And then, as a teenager, I'd kind of gotten into kind of Asian kind of mysticism, often kind of presented through a kind of Western lens. And so, when it came to, it was time to go to university, I just thought it would be really good to actually, encounter the traditions, Hinduism and Buddhism, on their own terms with a more kind of serious intellectual engagement. So, that was what kind of initially got me on the kind of road to studying religion. And then, I took some time out between my MA and my PhD. And when I applied for my PhD, I went to work with Jeffrey Kripal at Rice University. And you might know Jeff's work. He's quite popular, I think, in the integral kind of world. But he's really into this idea of the integrating kind of personal religious experience and especially mystical experience with the critical, skill set of, the academy. So he's written about this, he wrote about this model called the Gnostic scholar, where it says for our kind of, postmodern age, we really need to combine, the contemplative and the critical. So, I was really I was really drawn to that, that kind of call. So.
Yeah, awesome. And so also before sort of this interview, we were talking a little bit about your background and stuff, and you shared that you currently engage in sort of a Tibetan practice. And I was hoping if you could share a little bit about what led you to that. And
yeah, sure. Yeah. So, well, I'm 47 and I've been, practicing in really actually a few different lineages in Buddhism, since I was a teenager. I just basically practiced I'm very pluralistic at heart. So, I've traveled around a lot. So basically wherever I was, I generally just go to whatever Buddhist center there was, there.
Yeah.
But I was always really interested in kind of tantric Buddhism and, particularly the kind of model of working with the afflictive energies, a kind of alchemical kind of process. So I always had, a kind of interest in Tibetan Buddhism. And so I practiced with the Friends, what were they called? I can't remember what they're called. It's something like the Friends of the Preservation of the Mahayana tradition. It's a Gelugpa school. So I'd practiced, with them in Nepal actually, but I found the institution quite conservative and troubling in various ways. And so actually then I went to Rice University in Houston, and then, my professor at Rice is Ann Gleig, who is a famous Tibetan Buddhist scholar and practitioner in the Nyingma tradition. And so I just started to practice, in her center and her husband's center, Harvey Aronson. So their center is called Door Mountain. And, so I guess I started, practicing in that community and must have been 2004 when I first came to the States. So, and I've stayed, and been with them ever since. Okay,
cool. And I'm assuming, were you raised in sort of, what kind of religious background were you?
Yeah, no, I was Catholic. Yeah. Okay. So I was, and that was the other thing, I was very into religion when I was a kid. I was really I wanted to be a missionary. I'm kind of embarrassed to say, but I was really obsessed with the saints and, very much kind of cathected to that kind of Catholic worldview. And then really honestly, what happened was when I was a teenager, I realized I was gay. And so I kind of knew, at that time, there just wasn't a place to be gay in Catholicism.
Right.
Certainly in my Catholicism, my kind of community of Catholicism. So
Right.
I really feel like I've just always been on a kind of religious journey of sorts.
Right. Okay. Well, we share that similarity. So it'd be nice moving forward to see how we've branched out and sort of, talk about like an interreligious dialogue, having sort of a similarity with sort of Western Catholicism, and then kind of looking at sort of what maybe your own research has brought to your own now sort of religious life and stuff.
Sure.
Yeah. Awesome. So, I was hoping, with the title American Dharma, I was hoping, you could share with the listeners what you mean by Dharma.
Yeah, well, the first thing I'll say is the title was actually Yale's title. So
Okay.
it's quite there's a lot of negotiation goes into a book title, because the publishers, think about marketing and how to sell the book, which is good, because that's something I would be clueless about.
Yeah.
And so I think that, they wanted something catchy. And I really wanted something that kind of captured the thesis of the book, which is a subtitle, which is Buddhism Beyond Modernity, because that's kind of what I'm arguing. But with Dharma, it's kind of interesting, because Dharma, literally means the teachings of the Buddha. But I think that, a lot of people kind of tend to separate the Dharma from Buddhism, almost like, in some ways it's kind of parallel to what people do with religion and spirituality. They use a signifier religion to talk about, like, the institution of religion and the kind of cultural heritage of religion, and normally the bad things about religion, right? The limits of religion. And I think that the same thing kind of happens a lot with the Dharma, that it's kind of, taken away from Buddhism. And it's often used as a kind of signifier, for, universal truth, the essence of Buddhism, or, the part of Buddhism that's somehow, like above, like I'm working on a book on sexual abuse in Buddhism now. We've noticed, I and my colleague Amy Langenberg, we've noticed that often, it's similar, that when we're interviewing people, they want to separate Buddhism and Dharma, and they want to say, like, the abuses from the Buddhist side, the human side, the limited side, and then the Dharma is this kind of pristine, pure transcendent teaching that's always valuable. So I think, that, that's mostly, I think, how a lot of people think of Dharma, as the essence of Buddhism, or something, the real truth of Buddhism.
Right. And so I know, you talk about the triple gem. And so and I know you've talked about the colonization and how Buddhism sort of came more from that sort of a Western sort of title for it, rather than its original origin. Is that?
Yeah, well, it's kind of complicated, because actually it is actually really complicated. Sorry, I'm a bit tongue-tied. The kind of idea of the world religion of Buddhism is a kind of construct that, is constituted during the, colonialism, when the kind of comparative study of religion is happening. So Buddhism is, so that's another argument people say. They also say, well, Buddhism itself is a Western kind of construct. But on the other hand, so they use that to legitimate taking Dharma as something separate. And they point out that a lot of Buddhists don't call themselves Buddhists. They don't use the term Buddhists, but they might use the term, like, we follow the Dharma. So they say it's actually an emic category for Asian Buddhists as well. But then, so in some ways that's true. It is more faithful. But then, in another sense, Dharma is sometimes separated from Buddhism, to kind of claim an authority over it, and not have to kind of be obligated to the tradition. So you see that a lot in the secular mindfulness movement, where someone like Jon Kabat-Zinn will say, well, I'm not teaching Buddhism, I'm teaching the Dharma. So he's making a claim that he has an authority that he doesn't really need to answer to, monastics or concerns of the tradition. So it's actually there's quite a few different things that happen when you, in relationship to the Buddha and the Buddhism as an institution and a historical tradition. and the Dharma is this kind of living vitality.
Yeah.
It's quite complicated.
Cool. So hopefully we could try to unravel that as we move forward, because it seemed like it presses a button. I think if you come from maybe that traditional, maybe Asian Buddhist lineage or community, in which maybe his claim of which he's teaching the Dharma, it kind of sounded like it sends sort of shockwaves to go, well, how do you have the authority to claim that? And so I know Dharma is used often throughout the book, and I have a couple of different examples of just trying to really understand the specific meaning and how that can sort of set off an alarm maybe for some people. And I just want to kind of read this. Oh, unless you have something to say, go ahead.
No. I'm just, go right
So I was
ahead.
going to say, across the essays in the book, Buddhist and secular, particularly scientific perspectives blended seamlessly. This was achieved primarily by separating Buddhism as a religious and cultural particularity, and Dharma as the universal truth underlining and ultimately separate from that historic particularity. So I was kind of wondering, like, and so as you move through the book and we talk about sort of the different cultural ages that come in pre-modern, modern, etc., it almost seems like new dharmas are introduced sort of with each sort of new wave or level of awareness.
Yeah, well, I think that's one way of expressing it. It's almost like different groups of people separate Buddhism and Dharma for their particular kind of, agendas and, their priorities. And sometimes I think what's kind of interesting though is that you can also find, because Buddhism is itself as a concept, as a world religion, also developed in modernity and colonialism, there are actually some grounds to make that argument as a traditional argument, that followers of the Buddha didn't think of themselves as Buddhist in that way either. And also in the Pali Canon, there are like places, there is an argument that you can find in the Pali Canon, the Dharma as kind of transcending its container. So I think there are precedents for what's happening in the contemporary kind of moment of, separating Buddhism and the Dharma, and what is the Dharma. That the Dharma is, for example, there's the suttas that say the Dharma is essentially whenever the truth is spoken, that's the Dharma, and that truth might not be spoken from a Buddhist, authority like a monastic. So it's like this kind of relationship between, Buddhism institutionally and the authority of Buddhism and the Dharma. It's not like it just starts in modernity. There is that kind of thinking about it in the tradition. In the modern age, it's become, I think, more problematic for a variety of reasons. So one is with the secular mindfulness movement, for example. One is the critiques of commodification. So, there's this sense that, it's culture, there's, it's commodification, it's people making money off Buddhism by kind of sidestepping the tradition. There's also the critique of cultural appropriation, that it's, and the question of racism and whiteness and continuing colonialism, because a lot of the mindfulness movement, a lot of the leading, there's shifts happening, definitely. But a lot of the, early figures were, white men, for example. So it, and then there's, so I'd say colonialism, I'd say there's been critiques of that separation of the Dharma and Buddhism on the ground. It's colonialist, it's cultural appropriation, it's racist, it's commodification of the Dharma. And also there's people that are uncomfortable at the ways in which the scientific kind of authority frame is kind of prioritized over the religious kind of authority frame. So there's a lot of people who feel like, Buddhism is this great, wonderful tradition of Buddhism is being kind of diluted into a scientific framework, being assimilated to the scientific framework through, separating the Dharma and Buddhism. And they're saying, Buddhism should challenge the scientific framework. It shouldn't be reduced to it. So there's a lot of critique around that separation of Buddhism and Dharma. that I'm, sympathetic to various degrees. But then on
Right.
the other hand, I think there's a lot of there's a lot of kind of really interesting work that happens when you separate Buddhism and the Dharma. There's a religious vitality to it. There's also a way in which it allows people to remain committed to practice in the face of intense abuses. When they kind of lose faith, well, these great teachers many of them have committed sexual abuse.
Right.
But that could turn them away completely from practice. But what we've found is for many that they stay with practice because they say, well, that's Buddhism, that's a corrupt human form, but the Dharma is this like truth and this living vitality. And that's something that each generation or each kind of cultural group can kind of connect with and express in their own language. And I'm really into that. I think that's, I think that having this sense of, any religion, but I, just happen to study Buddhism, that is always in kind of flow. Like religion is lived, and it's lived through different types of bodies. So I'm kind of quite really enthusiastic about that, in general, even though I do kind of have a lot of kind of sympathy and share some of the more specific critiques.
Right. And so just to kind of expand on that a little bit, because I was in the book, I think it was Jack Kornfield's quote that said that American teachers took away the cultural baggage that they received from their Asian teachers to make the Dharma more accessible to the American lady. And so did you now, and I think you might have already answered, but just to make sure I'm clear on it, that it's not just a clear answer of that's good or that's bad. There's maybe possibly both good and bad to that.
Yeah, I mean, I would caution using the term cultural baggage because it's got like a really negative connotation, right? So I'm more of the view as a scholar and also as a practitioner as well, to be honest. But scholars, we think of, we would say all Buddhisms, because Buddhism's plural, are cultural. So it's not like, it's not as if like, oh, these, white, hippies suddenly, were able to lift, the Dharma out of this, cultural baggage. We would actually see that as really problematic, quite colonialist, quite ethnocentric, unfortunately has also led to, hierarchical racist kind of categories. But I think it's better to think more of what are the different ways that Buddhism becomes, how is Buddhism shaped differently in its different cultural contexts? So it's just like following, my arms are going everywhere here. Just
That's
following
okay.
it like in this, in this culture and that culture and then this culture. That's a much kind of, I think more historically true way of looking at it. Buddhism's always been cultural. It was cultural in India, in China, in Tibet, Japan. Now it's cultural in America, And it's also more ethical because you don't have one group of people saying we've got the true Dharma, and we've kind of lifted it out of culture. And, the white hippies were as culturally situated as anyone.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Well, I do know, and again, I'm going to probably mispronounce a lot of these names here, but
I'm terrible with pronunciation. Don't worry.
Yeah. So it was. I was looking up. It was a Trungpa quote, and I forgot about the West needing a very different approach to Buddhism. And I remember reading. I'm not sure if it was him directly when I was first sort of learning about Buddhism, but sort of recognizing that the Buddhist tradition, religion that was sort of existing in their own culture, that when the teachers came over here, they recognized either through the interaction of the American culture or Western culture that, something needed to change. And so is that sort of permissible, or is it sort of looked upon as maybe these hippie beatnik generation groups didn't really have permission to sort of extrapolate, and even looking at some of the more, and we'll get to sort of maybe the Buddhist geeks on how, extrapolate perhaps what's more accessible for an American culture while still integrating perhaps, the main content or transcendent content of Buddhisms.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think, in terms of when you ask a question like, is it permissible? Yeah, it's definitely permissible in the sense that, you know, the complication is that when Buddhism came over in the 1960s, you know,
Mhm.
there was already, you know, there's often this narrative that, you know, Buddhism started in America in the 1960s, but
Yes.
actually Buddhism came like 100 years before that. It came with
Right.
the Japanese and Chinese immigrants. So, you know, there was Asian American, you know, heritage Buddhists, that's a label that we use, you know, were already, you know, teaching Buddhism and preserving the Dharma, you know, often in the face of, you know, really awful conditions, intense racism, and then for Japanese Buddhists, you know, to live through the internment after Pearl Harbor.
Mhm.
And so I think there's, you know, one sense is that we want to be careful, you know, not to erase, you know, those Buddhist lineages out of the picture. So there was a sense of that there are these Buddhist communities that were already established in the US. But it seemed that, you know, there was a couple of things that came together in the 1960s, which was, you know, the hippie movement, all the, you know, revolution of the counterculture, LSD, obviously a huge thing. And then in 1965, the Asian Immigration Act, which banned immigration from Asia, was lifted. So then you had some of these key figures like Trungpa, Suzuki Roshi, you know, who came over and, you know, say like Suzuki Roshi came over actually to be a Japanese priest for the Japanese Buddhist community. But he found he was very interested in these, like he basically was really into the enthusiasm of the counterculture, like they really wanted to meditate, you know. And so I think the same with Trungpa, you know, he kind of landed in the counterculture, and there was this great kind of like need for, like, people wanted Asian religion, there was a romanticism. And
Yeah.
so, you know, you had these young kind of maverick teachers, you know, coming over to America, and then these, like, you know, young, like, radical hippies. And so they, you know, they really, it was a kind of a meeting of minds, you know.
Mhm. Yeah.
So then these teachers said, yeah, you know, we need to teach Buddhism in a way that speaks to you, you know. So it wasn't all on the hippies. It was like also their Asian teachers were like complicit in kind of creating this sense of, you know, the old Buddhism doesn't work for you, and we want to kind of revitalize it.
Yeah.
I think that, like, you know, overall, you know, I think that the spirit of like revitalization can be a really important one, especially around things like gender equity or like racial justice. You know, we want
Mhm.
to kind of make right now there's a huge movement of Black Buddhists of color saying, you know, we really want to make the Dharma speak to our community needs. I'm a fan of that. I'm a fan of lived religion. On the other hand, I think, you know, the kind of shadow side, as an integral person, that you probably think of it in terms of shadow, is it can lead to a kind of arrogance, you know, a kind of like not being in dialogue with the lineage, you know. I mean, there's like 2000, you know, there's, I don't know how many years, sorry, I mean, there's a lot, you know, there's thousands of years of Buddhist communities and practice, you
Right.
know, before Buddhism comes to America. So, you know, revitalize, make the Dharma speak for you and your community, but also, you know, show some respect, so show some humility and interest to be in dialogue with tradition, you
Right.
know. So I would say that, you know, I'm kind of like moving between my practitioner and scholarly identity here. I would say ideally there would be a dialogue, you know, with the tradition, you know, that was also, you know, on the side of tradition, open to, you know, making the Dharma speak for this cultural group, like recognizing that that is legitimate, you
Yeah.
know.
And so I guess from your practitioner side, I mean, are you also sort of knee deep in a lot of these issues in your own community as far as dealing with some of the, and maybe not so much, I mean, a chapter is dedicated to the sexual scandals that have happened in
Yeah,
certain Buddhist communities in America, but I was wondering, as a particular
yeah.
practitioner in your own community, is there sort of a rift happening that you know, that sort of appears that almost there's a split that's happening between, the Buddhas, the Dharma, the Sangha, and how exactly does a community get together to resolve these?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. So, it's quite a personal question, but I'm
Yeah.
happy to dig in. I'd say I feel like this sounds really I'm kind of embarrassed to say it because it sounds like, oh, look at my community is really special. But
Right.
I feel like I, I honestly, I don't know if I would practice in another Tibetan community other than the one I'm in. And the reason for that is because I kind of think of Door Mountain, my Sangha, as quite unusual in that um, it's got four elements that for me are really important to be held together. So one is that it's got, the traditional Buddhist kind of lineage. So the kind of, guru, the lama of the lama of my teachers. My teachers, Ann and Harvey. I actually call them mentors more than teachers because I'm a bit prickly around authority.
Yeah.
But they have, they've spent, over half their life, with, Tibetan teachers. They both speak fluent Tibetan. The Lama is Adsum Rinpoche, who lives in Tibet. He lives in Eastern Tibet. He's a huge figure in Tibet. They're very embedded in the Tibetan lineage. So through them, our Sangha is, gets the kind of, a real depth of traditional Tibetan practice. So we've got the depth of tradition. But we've also, Harvey Aronson is also a therapist as well as a Buddhist teacher. And so for me, psychoanalysis has been a huge influence on me intellectually and also personally. Right. And Harvey's written a lot about like the kind of translation of, Buddhist practice into like psychotherapeutic worlds, and so for me, having that psychological piece is like really crucial. And then the other piece is that the intellectual piece, Anne is a scholar. Harvey was also a scholar. He, did his PhD in Stanford, but then moved into the therapy. So they've got the intellectual critical side, they've got tradition, they've got psychotherapy. And over the last few years, we've kind of, the Sangha's, gotten more into like racial justice work. For me, it's really important because I'm, really committed to kind of anti-racist work and the Buddhism. Yeah. So for me, it's like, wow, I've got like, those four things in that one Sangha. And I haven't really, I don't see that all the time in Tibetan lineages. Right. I probably would practice in the Insight community, actually, if I wasn't, at Door Mountain. So I think for me, I do need all those pieces. And I've been really lucky that my Sangha hasn't had any, sex scandals or, any real, there has been some splits around the more traditionalist kind of Sangha members, like Harvey is he's quite innovative. And he brought a couple of things into the Sangha. Harvey and I are both in another spiritual group called the Diamond Approach. I don't know if you know it. Hamid Ali. Yeah. Right. And, Harvey brought a couple of exercises in from the Diamond Approach into Door Mountain. And some of the students were like, this isn't Buddhism. We don't want to do it. Like they were resistant. Yeah. And I was like, oh, I love it. Because that's like kind of who I am, Right. So anyway, I think he more or less stopped doing it. But again, I think, a lot of Sanghas, as you say, there are, have split or in the larger communities, and different centers are known, for like being more, like Spirit Rock's like really, much more innovative. IMS is known for like doing the more like traditional retreat model, even though that's actually a modernist model. So yeah, I think that, a lot of these things are playing out, and often they do end up causing schisms, Yeah. So I just got really lucky with Door Mountain.
Nice. And your chat, you went into, I forgot if it's a specific chapter or if it's scattered throughout, but there was a lot of different examples that have taken on sort of address sort of the issues that you've just talked about, racism and sexual scandals, and talked about how they're sort of evolving to address the sort of the need of that.
Yeah, there's some really interesting work going on because of, I'd say actually those two things, the sexual abuse and racial justice. Like one big theme is, moving away from the kind of single teacher model or, more like a hierarchical teacher model. So you're getting a lot of collectives, you know, or,
Yeah.
you know, there's like, I think the San Francisco Dharma Collective now is one group, Meditation Coalition in LA is another group, where it's really like, let's try and do, you know, let's do it this more collectively, let's try more like peer relationships, you know. I mean, I think Buddhist Geeks also tried to do that as well. They did a
Yeah.
lot of experimentation with like leadership models. You
Right.
probably know Buddhist Geeks because Vince is in the Integral world.
I am familiar with him, but also I learned more about it actually from your book than I knew just personally.
Oh,
So
good.
thank
Well,
you for that.
yeah, Vince was a great help. He gave me a lot of time. So
Yeah. And so that might lead sort of nicely with this next thing I wanted to bring up, that you, Thich Nhat Hanh quote was, "The next Buddha might take the form of a community." And I really like that insight. And I was hoping that maybe you could just share a little bit what you think he meant by that.
well, I think, you know, it's really interesting because I do talk about three turns at the end of the book, you know, in this shift from Buddhist modernism to, you know, Buddhism beyond modernity, whatever we call it, postmodern, post-secular, meta-modern is a new term that's coming up.
Yeah.
And one of them is this collective term. So it is this sense, I think there's just this sense across lineages that, you know, this kind of like focus on like one teacher as holding this kind of absolute authority is, you know, is just becoming kind of either problematic or redundant for like contemporary times. And so, you know, instead of like thinking about who's going to be the next Dharma successor or Dharma heir, or who will be the next Dalai Lama, will the Dalai Lama take a female form? That was a conversation for a while. You know, more and more people seem to be thinking about, well, really about the Sangha, about the community kind of stepping up and kind of, you know, taking that role of kind of a shared leadership kind of model.
Yeah.
I think some of it is also like a reaction to the kind of individualism of modernity and the individualism of Buddhism, you know, Buddhism, what we call Buddhist modernism. You know, there's just been you know, I mean, there's been some I think useful innovations because of that, but I think there's also been a lot of problems, you know, not just with power abuse, but just things like, for example, you know, the emphasis on individual meditation, you know, at the expense of other aspects of the Buddhist kind of life, like ethics or devotional practices, or just a practice of community, you know, the practice as a spiritual practice. And then, you know, with a lot of people doing intense meditation practice, so there's been like negative mental, you know, some people have had negative mental impacts from meditation. So you've got people like Willoughby Britton, is that right? Willoughby, who's been tracking, like she had a project called the Dark Night, you know, project, where I think they changed it to the varieties of contemplative practice. But she was a researcher at Brown University, and she and her team were kind of tracking, you know, a lot of people who, you know, had done this very intensive meditation practice, but decontextualized, you know, from a wider Buddhist support system or like other forms of Buddhist practice, just individual meditation, and had like nervous breakdowns, psychotic breaks, you know. So I think there's been a lot of phenomena that's happened that's been quite troubling, that's kind of led people to think like we really need to revision how we do Buddhism right now, you know. It seems a collective is kind of one place they've turned.
Yeah. You know, just had a flashback. I think I was watching, this was like, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, the Bill Moyers Houston Smith special. And
oh yeah, I remember that.
I think when I think this is where I'm getting it, but it's obviously, I think, examples that are common, where when he learned to be meditating in this, I believe it was a Zen Buddhist community, you know, they would have like a little switch or something that if you started falling asleep, they would kind of come up and give you a good whack. I mean, can you do that? Can you do that anymore? I mean,
that's so funny well, it's really funny you should say that, because, well, two things. One is you could say no, because, you know, it could be, you know, some people might consider it abuse and violence. But another thing is that with the first generation of female Zen, American Zen teachers, there was a teacher called Maureen Stewart, I think. And I think she might have died now, but she was kind of famous. She not famous, but she was well known in the Zen world, because instead of hitting her students with a stick, she'd kind of give them a massage. She'd she'd massage their shoulders.
I'd probably fall asleep more.
I know, right? But it was really interesting, because it was kind of like articulated as, this is like another way to do practice. Like you can do practice through being gentle,
right,
and attune to the student. You don't have to whack them. It kind of got gendered as like the traditional Zen is patriarchal, and it's got the samurai and then the stick. There's an name forgotten. And then now, we're developing a Zen which is more feminine and more about like living in the world, and kind of just waking someone up like gently.
I like that.
So so I think that just kind of came to mind.
Yeah, definitely. There's different approaches, right? You could have a feather or a stick. The point is to bring your awareness back from falling asleep to awareness. Yeah, I like that. And so one of the things that sort of I wanted to bring up too was not just the boomer generation, right? And sort of got dragged in this, in the sense of maybe the negatives that they brought to the tradition, or to their own approach to Buddhism. And you kind of talked about how Generation X is more progressive and politically oriented. And I was wondering though, is there any, and sort of their insistence maybe on over meditating, but is there any negative perhaps to the Generation X of their approach to it? For example, and you kind of said more like they don't really get away from the meditation, but only sort of expand and sort of to these other areas. But is there any negatives that you have seen sort of that the Generation X has sort of brought in the younger generations that could be seen or viewed as a negative?
Well, I think every generation or cultural group has, again, like maybe you'd say a shadow or a limit, I would say, okay, so with the Gen X, one of the things that is kind of troubling me a little bit with the Gen X is when I did the Gen X interviews, I was mostly just really interested in like their self-image, like how they saw themselves as different than the boomers. And what I found was, they kind of narrated it as almost like they were the opposite. So they'd say, the boomers are individualistic, we're collective. Or the boomers are like wanted to be like Dharma rock stars, but we're more interested in being, peers and not big, not the Christmas tree light type of thing.
Right.
So I just took them on, their own terms, So I was like, okay, so they want to be collective and they want to do like peer-to-peer accountability. But, since I wrote the book, which is a while now, I have kind of noticed that some of the Gen X teachers that I interviewed, some of them, have left communities and haven't started their own communities. And in fact, seem themselves to be more like, kind of touring different Dharma centers, So for me, I'm a bit like, well, you're not really like, you're not walking. What do they say? You're not walking.
Walk the talk. Yeah.
So I'd say that like where I'm at with them now is that I think that, I'd actually love to do a follow-up with them because, my data's a bit old now, and I'd like to see, you said that you're interested in collectiveness and peer accountability. Like, what have you done to that end? So mostly for now, it's more like, are they enacting what they're, is it just rhetoric or is it a reality? I think another limit of the Gen X's, what some people have expressed frustration is that there's not much monastic representation. So in the conferences, they really were thinking really like intentionally about racial diversity, sexual identity, gender identity.
Yeah.
But like a few people said to me, there's very few monastics here. And some of the people who had more monastic training, some of the Gen Xers who had more monastic training, felt that one of the one of the like limits of the Gen X was that they didn't they didn't respect the monastic training as much as they should. You know, so there was almost like, I guess there was some feeling of there was too much equalizing across lay teachers and the monastics. But mostly that's just, you know, anecdotal in terms of what those Gen Xers told me. And I really would, I'd have to do some proper, you know, proper field work to really get a better sense.
Yeah. I guess my final question is, you know, you talked about, I know meta modern is sort of a popular term right now. You mentioned ultra modernism sort of in the book and stuff. And just in your own opinion, where do you think the future of Buddhism is in the West is going, or even possibly should go? And do you think it's on the right track?
Wow, yeah, that's like, it's quite a big question. Quite no pressure. Well, I think that, you know, I mean, I've been really kind of, you know, quite amazed at how, you know, quickly, you know, the shift has been around racial justice. So I think that, you know, it was like, you know, the Buddhists of color that I was working with, you know, were working like, you know, for nearly 30 years trying to make changes in these majority white kind of centers. And it was just, you know, it was so slow, you know, there was nothing was really changing. And then really since like 2015, like it's just so many things have happened. There's so many more conferences, you know, Black Buddhists, Buddhists of color. If you look on Spirit Rock's website, there's like, you know, so many day longs for like Asian American Buddhists, indigenous, you know, Buddhists. So I think there's been a real kind of, you know, flowering of the racial justice work. And I think that's going to continue. I mean, the numbers, you know, in terms of like the numbers of Buddhists of color on like the Insight mailing list is just, I mean, it's like, it literally went from something like 100 to like 21,000. Wow. So I think we're going to, it's really amazing. So I think we're going to see more, you know, more diversity. I hope that there's more, I'm hoping for like multiracial, you know, sanghas. I'm hoping that there's, you know, I'm hoping to see more conversation across, you know, I think there's definitely shifts in that way. I'm actually working on some of the backlash to racial justice. So I'm, you know, that's kind of a bit depressing for me because I'm really committed to anti-racism. I'm hoping that, you know, things get better. I'm hoping that some of the white Buddhists who seem to be really threatened and misunderstand, you know, the racial justice movement, I'm hoping that, you know, that they kind of like, you know, kind of change basically. So I think that'll happen. I think, you know, I think pluralism is going to continue. I think there's going to be more, you know, secular forms of Buddhism. You know, I think that will continue. And I do think that will also be, I just think there's often like counter movements, you know, it's like often the more secular Buddhism articulations there are, then there's a kind of pushback of like, no, we want to kind of like go back to the canon, or we want to be, you know, we want to have monastic communities. So I'm just expecting a lot of variety, I think, to happen.
And another question came up as you were saying that. It was one I wanted to talk on because it's near and dear to my heart, is the topic of neoliberalism and capitalism. And just if you had to take, I mean, I don't know if it's brought up in the book, but there's, I think, is there any sort of more attention being drawn to sort of, you know, workers' rights and poverty, and what's your take on that?
Well, I'm so glad that you asked me that question. I actually think, because I think one of the questions that you'd sent me, I remember thinking I would like to talk about class. I wanted to talk about class. So I think that like I would like to see more engagement around class as a category of diversity within Western Buddhism. There's a lot. I actually wrote a short article on a reflection on class for Lion's Roar, and there is a lot of crossover with like a lot of the Black Buddhists I interviewed, for example, were working class. So I engaged, you know, issues of class, but I also think it's not, you know, the Buddhists of color, there's similarities and crossovers, but it's not always the same. And so I would like more attention on issues of class. To that end, I've seen two interesting things. One is an attempt to unionize Dharma teachers, which I think is really interesting. I guess they tried something. I think they did it with yoga teachers. I think there was a model of yoga teachers unionized. So that's really interesting. What would come of that? And then I think that there's been a lot more engagement with neoliberalism and critiques of capitalism, in essentially because of the mindfulness movement. I think, some mindfulness has gone in many different ways. It's gone in a social justice way, but it's also gone in a super corporate way, as you know. And I think the critiques of corporate mindfulness have, led to more engagement in Buddhism, as a wide field, as well as mindfulness of, capitalism. And honestly, Buddhist Geeks, I think, is a really good example, because I think that, like, when I first started tracking Buddhist Geeks, they were quite enthusiastic about, like, my sense was that they were quite enthusiastic about, like, conscious capitalism, doing capitalism better. But I've really seen Vince and Emily go much more critical. Like, they're much more critical of capitalism, and they're doing this really cool model of transparency where they have all their economics as transparent. And I've got, like, a lot of respect for them, and I think they're very, I think that's there's a lot of different communities that are working with capitalism, like racial justice groups are working with economics because race and capitalism are so linked. But another example would be, I think, the Buddhist Geeks, because they seem so into that tech world, in Silicon Valley Buddhism. So to see them kind of get much more critical and talk about, like, post-capitalism, and that's kind of really interesting. Or what do you think? Like, what's your sense of the post-capitalism spirituality?
Well, I'm on another podcast too, Growing Down, where we've kind of tackled sort of what's the integral sides, specifically on leftist politics, and trying to
Jeremy.
Yes, exactly.
I love that. It's great. Yeah, really good stuff. Yeah,
definitely. So we've been trying to just gather, for me, I'm in more the information gathering stage to try to figure out what are people's takes on this, and how, if you are coming at it from an integral lens, how can you be a Republican, for example, with maybe a current platform that maybe Trump stood for? And so I honestly will say right now, I don't think I have the clear answer. I have some ideas, but for me, it's a lot about these different communities that come from maybe a religious or spiritual perspective. How can we look at this issue of capitalism, poverty? And it's such a broad subject, because I don't think it necessarily means, not having open free markets. But what does that mean to make sure, I always call it like raising the floor, the social net, a security net where people aren't having to struggle and suffer, but have some sort of, basic health care that, how can you flourish without some basic social standards?
Yeah, it's that kind of like what Andrew Yang's into. It's like raising the bottom up to a certain level, and then being okay with, like, kind of, the free market hierarchies on top of that. It's kind of like, I mean, I'm from England, and so I work with the National Health Service, and amazing free. I'm from a really working class background, so class is actually really just something really dear to my heart. I always say it shaped me more than anything. My class, more than, like, my sexuality, my gender, more than my race. Although, most white people, think don't see their whiteness as a factor. So I really like this turn in spirituality of trying to grapple more, with the excesses of capitalism, whether, that be, I think Jeremy seems more like he's a Bernie guy, isn't he? He's like, but it sounds like you're a bit different, but you want to kind of still tackle it. I think that's really true in Buddhism. I think that you probably have that range, that you've got some, Marxist Buddhists, and then you've got more Buddhists who are like, well, capitalism as it's in its current iteration is clearly not working, and our retreat model is clearly not working because it is really elitist and not that many people can afford to go on retreat, but they don't necessarily want to go, like, all the way Marxist,
To me, the interesting piece is having that dialogue and making sure we're all speaking the same language, so to speak. And I think for me, it's just about continuing to kind of stoke that fire. And I think part of this conversation with you is to kind of bring in the Buddhist perspective, and to have just, what is going on in your own community, in the Buddhist community, and ultimately just have these conversations and see if people are seeing it differently. And hopefully we can all eventually come together and, I know, attack the suffering that's happening in the world, whether you come at it from a Christian perspective, Hindu perspective, whatever perspective. But let's all hopefully start seeing things, where we can start tackling these issues and reduce the suffering.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love kind of centering the reduction of suffering. And I think like it kind of like you seem to have an interest in Buddhism and your Catholic background. Suffering's like something like Catholics and Buddhists, like they know something about it, right?
Yes. Yes.
So
Yes.
it seems like I appreciate your work.
I appreciate your work, and hopefully I could have you on again and see what you're working on again. And I loved your book. I'd highly recommend it.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Matt.
All
Nice
right.
chat. Bye.
Appreciate it.